the ancient Stoics used the word therapia to describe what they're doing, the word therapy. Like they call it a therapy of the mind or a therapy of the psyche. This was a cliche, it was a familiar term in ancient philosophy. Socrates described his method as a kind of medicine or a therapy for the mind. So it wasn't just the Stoics, but the Stoics were the school that was best known for developing this aspect of philosophy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Weeks. Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. My guest today on the podcast is Donald Robertson. Donald is a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, writer, and one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of ancient philosophy and modern psychology. Donald is the author of 8 books, including his most recent How to Think Like Socrates and How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and many others. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the BBC. He is also the founder of Plato's Academy Center in Athens and a founding member of the Modern Stoicism nonprofit. Over the last 2 decades, Donald has trained thousands in evidence-based psychological skills, drawing deeply from classical philosophy, especially Stoicism. Donald's background is very unique. He's a psychotherapist with a clinical practice, training schools in London. He's published works that span history, psychotherapy, and ancient wisdom texts. In this conversation, we explore the idea of Stoics as ancient psychotherapists. Donald makes the case that Stoicism wasn't just a philosophy of life, but also a clear system of therapy, rooted in ancient Greek and Roman thought, developed centuries before Freud. So we talk about practical frameworks for navigating emotional challenges. If you're someone who overthinks, struggles with uncertainty, like me, or just wants a more grounded way to move through the world, I think you'll appreciate this episode. Some of the key ideas we get into is why Stoicism may be the original psychotherapy and how it directly shaped modern CBT, the Stoic quote that launched an entire field of therapy, how to apply ancient philosophy to modern challenges, including relationships, career pressure, crisis moments, workplace issues. And then we get into tools and techniques and mental models for gaining perspective, the relationship between rumination and depression, why we get stuck and how to break that loop. We talk about control issues and stress, what's in your power, what's not, and how that clarity transforms both anxiety and regret, and how success can become a trap and why some setbacks are the best thing that could happen to us. There's a lot more here, so give it a listen. And without further ado, here's Donald Robertson. Donald, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it.
Thank you for coming on. So all things Stoicism and anxiety, stress, and depression levels. Modern society in general, what comes along with modernity seems to be some level of depression. And
yeah, that's a big question, actually, because so on the face of it, prevalence rates of mental health problems continually increase, at least like in America and Britain, like in the first world. Depression is virtually an epidemic, but throughout history, people have kind of complained of, the decay of society and so on. And so one question is whether changes in the criteria for diagnosis or methods of diagnosis might be increasing artificially.
People self-identifying as depressed.
Yeah, there's different ways of kind of measuring it. Here's a little bit of trivia for you, actually, that's kind of notorious. Mental health psychiatry used to be called a branch of abnormal psychology. That was the terminology that's traditionally used to refer to it. A few years ago, the National Institute for Health in America did the largest prevalence study of mental health issues, and they found a lifetime prevalence of 52% of mental health problems in general in the US. So a lot of people said, well, hang on a minute. If the majority, if over 50% of people have it, that doesn't mean that they currently are diagnosable, but it means that are currently or have in the past had a mental health diagnosis. Then how is that abnormal? Surely it's abnormal if you don't have a history of mental health problems now because they're so prevalent. So that's the kind of talking point that a lot of people in the mental health field had brought up a few years ago, is that this is now the norm. Basically, it's past the 50% mark. So yeah, you could definitely say, at least on the face of it, that these things are becoming more common. But there are some issues about the way that we label mental health issues and the diagnoses that are used and so on. So it is a little bit of a complex question. Obviously during the pandemic, I don't know what the data are. I haven't kept up with that on mental health prevalence during the pandemic. I mean, on an anecdotal level, though, what I've seen, and I've seen other people in mental health talking about, is sometimes there's a paradoxical effect of facing a stressful situation whereby some people feel better. You'll hear these anecdotes like, people in Britain would say during the Second World War, there were people that said it was the best time of their life, like living through the Blitz and stuff like that. And I think Spike Milligan's a famous British comedian said when he fought in the Second World War, it was the happiest time of his life, even though it seemed like a great catastrophe. And the pandemic, I think, ironically, for some people, it's really damaged their mental health. And for other people, they actually feel better.
I have a lawyer friend who we've known each other for 20 years, very unhappy generally. Just, it's a stressful occupation. Something happened during the pandemic where he seemed lighter. And when I finally said, what's going on in your life? He let work go. Something happened where he was no longer going to an office and he let go of the importance of it. Something happened psychically to him that he held everything lighter.
There are many ways in which that happens. I mean, I'll just rattle off some quickly. First, as a kind of aside to this, it's well known in mental health now that there's a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, whereby, we all know post-traumatic stress disorder. So when people go through traumatic events in civilian life or in the military, sometimes they develop this mental health problem called post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's also research that shows when people go through similar events, they may actually become more resilient, or their well-being may actually improve as a consequence of experiencing adverse effects, stressful life events. And other ways in which it can benefit people, maybe, some people adopting a more minimalist lifestyle, so not going out and socializing as much and things like that during lockdowns made some people reappraise their priorities in life. And audiobooks have boomed. A lot more people are reading. People changed their diet, their exercise regime. Like many people, when they were faced with the prospect of being stuck at home during lockdown, reevaluated their daily routine and embraced a more healthy lifestyle. Not everyone did that, but some people saw it as an opportunity. In another sense in which I think it has benefited people in general, it's caused people to consider their own mortality in ways that maybe they didn't before. And in Stoicism, we think of the contemplation of death again, I would say, as an exercise, as an opportunity. Again, for some people that can be depressing or stressful, but for other people, it can become an opportunity for them to radically reevaluate their values and priorities in life in a way that's therapeutic.
When I look back on any kind of personal growth in my life, 8 times out of 10, it's something difficult. Problem or tragedy or something that causes me to stop, reflect. What are my priorities? Where am I right now in my life? And what do I want? What's important and what's not important is key to me. Like, I've leaned my ladder on this wall. Why am I doing that? That's not important.
Ancient philosophy is quite complicated. So sometimes people ask me to explain Socrates or Plato or the Stoics to them. And sometimes I talk to children about philosophy and I think, what's like the real easiest takeaway? There are a number of easy takeaways. But actually one of them is that Socrates in particular thought we should just be talking a lot more about what wisdom looks like and what the definition of that word is, what it means to be wise, as opposed to just being clever. And my little girl is 10 now, asked me what wisdom meant. And I thought, what's the easiest definition I can give to a kid? I thought, what the Stoics say that wisdom is, to paraphrase it slightly, is knowing what's important in life. And also that means realizing that a lot of the things that other people think are important aren't as important as they think they are. So kind of seeing through some of the values of society and so on. I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And to some extent, it comes from reflecting on our own past experience and looking back in our lives and maybe realizing that some of the setbacks we've experienced in life might actually have turned out to be for the best. So the things that people normally view as setbacks or catastrophes aren't necessarily as negative as people assume that they are when we look back on them with the benefit of hindsight. And the ability to kind of really wrap your head around that, I think, is a type of wisdom. And actually, it's a type of wisdom that comes partly from experience and also partly from reflection.
It reframes problems or difficulties, and it also reframes success, because success is a wonderful thing, but it's blinding in a way.
Success can destroy you.
And it could destroy you, yeah. But nobody thinks of it. And the Holy Grail is success. And thusly, we don't embrace the suffering part.
The funniest examples ever saw of that in Britain, we have this national lottery, and they often have a celebrity who draws the numbers or whatever. And I saw the pop star Robbie Williams doing it once, and the draw is live. And I always remember he was just kind of like he had to draw the balls out or whatever. And just before he did it, he turned to the camera and kind of gave it a wink or whatever. And he kind of whispered, "It won't make you happy."
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's drawing the lottery. Like, I thought that was kind of funny, but it's an interesting point. Yeah, you're right. Success as a therapist, if I reflect on my experience as a therapist, hands down, success has often been the worst thing that happens, in a sense, or what appears like success to many clients. So a good example would be getting a promotion at work. That's the worst thing that happens to a lot of people. Often it leads to, in many cases, no, obviously not in all cases, but in many cases, people struggle really hard to get promoted at work. And then they get promoted maybe above their level of competence. Or maybe now they're working longer hours and it destroys their marriage or something like that. You've got to be careful what you wish for sometimes. And sometimes setbacks are the best things that happen to people. So if I look at the clients I've worked with over the years, an obvious example is relationship breakups. My wife left me. It sounds cliche to say, well, maybe that's for the best, but perhaps it's better that the relationship ends than that you carry on in an unhealthy, or an unhappy marriage. And then people are often unhappy for a while, but then they move on and start another relationship. And then, if we look back over our lives at the first part, most people have had multiple partners over the course of their life, and most people, if they look back, think, yeah, obviously, if I hadn't broken up with my high school girlfriend or whatever, then I wouldn't have gone on to have all the other relationships, and I wouldn't be married to my current wife and stuff like that, So one thing needs to end in order for another thing to begin, but you only really see that when you look backwards. When you're looking forwards, you just think, oh, this is a catastrophe. I've kind of lost everything or whatever. Jobs are the same. A lot of the clients that I've worked with, this is just a kind of superficial observation in a way, but, I meet many people who got quite mundane jobs and then maybe they got made redundant or something didn't work out. And that seemed catastrophic to them. And then maybe they struggled financially for a while, but often went on to find a better job, or in many cases became self-employed. And then that was stressful for them, but ultimately for many of them, it became more fulfilling because it gave them more freedom, more control over the direction of their lives. So this is a cliche in Greek philosophy, because actually it's a central premise of many of the Greek tragedies, that what looks like good fortune often turns out to be bad fortune and vice versa. And so for Greek philosophers, this almost seemed so obvious it wasn't worth stating. But, if only the majority of people really grasped that, I think that insight alone would help them to become more emotionally resilient.
I feel the same way with one of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, which is suffering. It's universal truth. And that's not a popular concept, but it's the rent you pay to be alive is suffering in somewhere along the line. It's not an abnormality. It's just built into the whole ecosystem. And just understanding, acknowledging that has some positive effect to brace and accept it, and that it's a part of it. So let's talk about the wisdom literature and how it helps us with emotional distress. And specifically, I just wanted to touch on this idea of Stoics being ancient psychotherapists, because you state that Stoicism provided a clear example of a system of psychotherapy in ancient Greek or Roman philosophy. Could you expound on that?
Yeah. So actually, when we first started talking about this, there were some people that were quite skeptical about that. I think it's fun over the course of a career, that you see there are certain debates that happen and then just disappear because the argument ends up being won. So when we first started doing this, and when I wrote my first book about philosophy and CBT, there were a lot of people who said, mainly academic philosophers, who said, look, there isn't psychotherapy in Stoicism or anything like that. Like, you guys are kind of like just trying to project CBT in it or kind of like read between the lines and stuff. But nobody really says that anymore because there are so many books now about the psychological strategies that we find in Stoicism.
Yeah, and the relationship.
Well known.
Yeah.
Like, so it's interesting to see the argument just disappears, like, because those guys are wrong. Like, and everybody can see that now. So the ancient Stoics used the word therapia to describe what they're doing, the word therapy. Like, they call it a therapy of the mind or a therapy of the psyche. This was a cliche. It was a familiar term in ancient philosophy. Socrates described his method as a kind of medicine or a therapy for the mind. So it wasn't just the Stoics, but the Stoics were the school that was best known for developing this aspect of philosophy. And they had entire books about Stoic therapia. They don't exist anymore, unfortunately, but we have other books that reference them or draw on them. So Chrysippus, who was one of the most famous founders of the Stoic school, wrote a book called On Therapeutics. It was all about Stoic psychotherapy. We have one whole book about Stoic psychotherapy that survives today on a particular topic, and it's by Seneca, and it's called On Anger. It's a book about Stoic philosophical and psychological therapy for the treatment of anger. And we also have a book by a guy called Galen, who was an ancient physician and a very prolific writer, and he was the court physician of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And Galen has a book called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul or the Psyche's Passions. And so it's a very early book on psychiatry or psychotherapy, and that survives today. And he, although he's not a Stoic, he's read Chrysippus' book and these other earlier lost books on psychotherapy, and he quotes them and draws on them. Sometimes he disagrees with them. So that's kind of what ancient literature is like. Sometimes we lose the original book and then we have other books that react to it or use it or comment on it. So that's the state of the ancient Stoic literature. But in the surviving Stoic texts, we have lots of examples of these techniques. I'll give you one very easy one. In the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which is probably the best known, most widely read Stoic text today, Marcus Aurelius has a passage, Book 11, Chapter 18, if anyone wants to go look it up, where he lists 10 different cognitive strategies for coping with anger in one passage. So he rattles off a list, like a toolbox or an armamentarium, as we would say, of psychological techniques. So sometimes we have to kind of reconstruct Stoic therapy a little bit, because what we don't have is like a proper text that spells it out in detail. Those existed, but they're gone now. Like, what we have is kind of fragments and references from other authors or examples that have been put into use. So we have to kind of like infer some things from that. But yeah, the Stoics had a psychotherapy. Yeah. And not only that, but it became the philosophical inspiration in the 1950s, 1960s for cognitive therapy. So in particular, Albert Ellis, who's a New York psychotherapist, who developed a technique in the 50s called rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT, which was either the main precursor or the earliest form of modern cognitive behavioral therapy, depending on how you look at it. He's a pioneer of CBT. Ellis had read the Stoics. He'd mainly read Epictetus and to some extent Marcus Aurelius. He doesn't seem to have read Seneca. And he was very heavily influenced by Stoicism. And the main quote he took from the Stoics is now probably the single most famous quote from Stoicism. And it's from chapter 5, section 5 of Epictetus's handbook, or Enchiridion. And it says, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And Ellis taught that quote to all of his students and all of his clients. And he mentions it in most of his many, many books. So it became a cliche in cognitive behavioral therapy. And I read that and I thought, that's really weird. Like, how come these psychotherapists don't say more about ancient Stoicism? Because they quote this quote all the time. They all know it, but there's probably a lot more that they could draw from Stoicism. And so that was what got me started writing books about the subject.
Yeah, and to that point, is there some amplification of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy to know the philosophies behind it? So, and I'm assuming you would say yes, but are the Stoic techniques or these ancient wisdom techniques different enough as to multiply these cognitive heuristics? So does this lead to more tools in the toolbox, as it were?
Yeah.
Or is it a blend?
On several levels, yes. So one of them is when I wrote my first book about this subject, the thing that I said is, look, in CBT, we have a kind of professional obligation, because it's evidence-based practice, to recommend that clients go and see a qualified mental health practitioner and they get a diagnosis if they've got a mental health problem, and they get an evidence-based treatment plan. So we wouldn't say, off you go and read Marcus Aurelius if you're clinically depressed, right? That would be unethical, right? We'd say, no, go and see somebody who's qualified to assess you properly, and they'll give you a modern state-of-the-art treatment plan. However, reading Marcus Aurelius could be used as an adjunct to complement that. It would complement it very nicely, thanks very much. And when I first started off, Stoicism wasn't quite as popular. It was just beginning to become popular. But what's changed now is that a lot of clients in CBT will say that they've been reading about Stoicism online. So that gets them talking to the therapists about it. And then it allows the therapist to say, well, a lot of the CBT techniques would complement the Stoicism stuff. And the difference about Stoicism is that Stoicism, first and foremost, is a philosophy. It's a philosophy of life that happens to have this therapeutic dimension to it. And CBT is not a philosophy of life, although it would be very tempting to try and construct one of it. CBT, generally speaking, is meant to be time limited, problem focused, goal directed. So you go and see a therapist, and then you stop seeing a therapist at some point, and you pop out the other side of therapy. Hopefully you're improved, but you're not supposed to see cognitive therapists indefinitely, generally speaking. And so therefore CBT doesn't kind of aim to be a lifelong...
It's a skill you learn, right? It's a thing you do. Teach a man to fish type of thing.
Yeah. Now there's some kind of gray areas, some exceptions to that. So what people sometimes look for, they do the CBT and they think, wow, this is amazing. It's given me these great insights and it's helping my panic attacks, my depression or whatever. But it has implications for life in general. I mean, the stuff I've learned from CBT about helping with panic attacks would probably help me deal with my relationships and deal with anger and other stuff in life. And life, some of the bigger questions in life. But CBT doesn't really aim to do that. Its vision isn't as grand as that. Its scope isn't as broad as that. And that's where Stoicism comes in. Stoicism maybe answers the question, what would happen if you took the basic insights and techniques from CBT and turned them into a philosophy of life? Well, if you did that, you'd end up with something that looks more or less like Stoicism, arguably. Or at least it would be comparable to Stoicism in many ways. And so I think that's why people are drawn to Stoicism and why they often compare it to CBT. Stoicism is bigger. Okay, it's not just for Christmas.
Yeah, I see a grid, let's call it ancient wisdom, Stoicism, and in philosophy, how to live generally or about life generally, dichotomy of control is one. But within that big square, I see dots of techniques that are CBT, right? Thought disputation, managing shoulds. And I see these as, maybe I see an OS, an operating system, and then applications on top of it, something like that, right?
Well, and I guess what I'd add as well, like, so people always want to know about specific techniques. I'll come back to those in a moment. But
and I've got the list. I want to jump in that list. Yeah, I
think as a preface to that, as a bit of context, it's important that people understand what cognitive therapy is, first of all, right? So in a nutshell, the easiest way to explain it is this: clients come into therapy and they say, hey, I'm depressed or I'm anxious. And then they say, and it sucks. Like, it's ruining my life. It's ruining my relationship. It's affecting my performance of work. It's giving me stomach ulcers or whatever. Like, and it's affecting my sleep, or et cetera, right? So clients will come in, they'll describe a presenting problem, and then they'll describe its consequences or its impact on their life. In doing that, like in the initial psychotherapy session, what they do, without realizing it perhaps, is lay out a motivation for change, right? Now, at that initial session, they haven't already changed, right? Because maybe they don't know how. So usually they arrive at what psychotherapists sometimes call a point of stuckness. So the client will talk for maybe the best part of an hour about how their depression is wrecking their life and how awful it is and how it's been bothering them for years or whatever, and they can't see a way out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you might be thinking, geez, you'd probably want to do something about that then, wouldn't you? And so then the client will say, but I can't help it. It's just how I feel. And at that point, Ellis would lean forward and smile at them and say, yeah, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think. And that, my friend, is really the beating heart of cognitive psychotherapy, because it's based on what we sometimes call the cognitive model of emotion. And that's the idea that emotions aren't completely separate from thoughts. And most people assume that they are. In our folk psychology, as we call it, in the psychology that most people take for granted in daily life, we think of emotions as being over there and thoughts as kind of being over there, and they're kind of vaguely related. But in cognitive therapy, we say, no, they're very tightly related, and in ways that you don't understand at first, like in secret and hidden ways sometimes. Your underlying beliefs, your patterns of thinking are maintaining your depression or anxiety. And that's really important because beliefs have propositional value. In many cases, they're true or false. And that means you could dispute them, as you mentioned earlier, and you could replace them, and you could evaluate them, and you could challenge them. So it opens up, this insight opens up a whole toolbox of therapeutic cognitive techniques. And it's the same insight that the Stoics had when they said, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And then you might think, well, being upset sucks. Like sometimes it kind of gets to you after a while. Like maybe we want to look at the opinions that cause our upset and make sure those opinions are actually true and rational and beneficial. And maybe we can work on those opinions and improve them. And then our emotions would change as a consequence. That's the heart of Stoicism and also the heart of cognitive therapy. Now, from that common shared premise, which is really fundamental, it's like the root of everything. From that common premise and from that quote from Epictetus that expresses it in plain English, you're probably going to arrive at similar conclusions. So if that's your starting point. So the Stoics inevitably are going to arrive at certain conclusions about techniques that you could use to identify those opinions and change them and stuff. And cognitive therapists are going to go, yeah, we arrive at similar conclusions, because we've diagnosed the cause of the problem in similar ways. So if you both agree on the cause, you're potentially going to agree on the cure. And that's why there's a lot of parallels. There's a historical influence, like Ellis had read the Stoics, and so he drew some direct inspiration from them. But also cognitive therapists, because they'll start off from the same assumption to some extent as Stoics, they're bound to arrive at similar kinds of techniques. Now, the first book I wrote, I identified 18 different psychological strategies that you can find in the Stoic therapeutic literature. And many of them are similar to things that cognitive therapists or other psychotherapists do today, but some of them aren't really. And so I'll give you an example. Right at the very beginning, when I started, I was only talking to psychotherapists about Stoicism for many years. I'd speak about it. It dawned on me one day, actually. Now I speak at all sorts of conferences. For years, I only spoke at psychotherapy conferences about Stoicism. And my audience would just be loads of psychotherapists. And I wrote books and articles just aimed at psychotherapists. And the audience has changed. Now it's much more of the general public that are interested in this. So when I spoke to my trainees, like therapists and supervisees and so on, I'd talk to them sometimes about Stoicism. And they'd say, oh yeah, that sounds like stuff we do in therapy. And I say, but there's this other technique that the Stoics use, which scholars call the view from above. And it's pretty common in Marcus Aurelius's meditations. He mentions it at least half a dozen times in different ways. You can seem to find references to it in the other Stoics, of Megma and Seneca. And then in other philosophical literature, it seems to crop up as well, like it was a bit of a familiar concept or cliche in ancient philosophy. And it involves visualizing your life from high above, as if you're like Zeus looking down from Olympus. You've seen Clash of the Titans in these old movies where the Olympian gods are looking down and humans are like chess pieces or whatever. So looking down as if from high above or from a helicopter or whatever. Or there's another version of it that's more cosmological, that involves just imagining your place in space and the totality of the universe and the present moment in relation to the entire history of the universe, the whole of time and space.
You're changing your perspective.
Massively expanding your perspective, right? And the Stoics think this is a kind of mystical technique because they go, geez, like, whose perspective is that? Like, and they go, well, Zeus's, like, it's the perspective of God in a way. You're kind of trying to wrap your head around, you put yourself in the shoes of God by using your imagination, very simply, right? And the Stoics thought this was therapeutic. And at first I was like, it's a cool technique because it's super easy to describe. And actually, you could record a guided meditation, like really standardize it really easily. So I did. And I would just play that 20-minute guided exercise to people and get them to do it. So we could standardize the whole thing. And then I'd say to my therapists, what do you guys make of this? And it's a technique that fascinates psychologists because it's easy to replicate and it has a very obvious psychological effect. So then we just have to ask, is it a good effect or a bad effect? So like, what are the consequences? It definitely does something. But then what would be the benefits of doing that? And I think that's something that we still have to explore, but there's good reason to assume that it has the potential because we know from many research studies that we know a lot about emotion. One of the things we know is that when people become very emotional, if they're angry or in particular anxious, it changes their thinking patterns.
It narrows.
They narrow the scope of attention. So they do, if it's anxiety, they do this thing called threat monitoring, like where they narrow down their focus and they look around their environment for possible signs of danger because they're scared. That's what we do when they're scared. If you were back in a long time ago, when you and I were little furry animals, I don't know if you can remember that far back. Right.
I'm a furry animal now.
Ancient history, where we were just little furry animals out on the plains. Like if you saw another furry animal on the horizon and it had sharp-looking teeth and it was looking your way, like it would make sense that you would want to forget about nuts and berries and mating or whatever else is on the mind of little furry animals and just focus like a laser beam on that thing with the pointy teeth on the horizon in order to kind of like duck out of the way or run in the opposite direction or whatever it is that you need to do to survive, right? That's not as useful when you're speaking to your bank manager on the phone or something like that today necessarily, right? So what was adaptive for our ancestors might be maladaptive in modern society in some ways, because the cost that we pay for that in part is that we exclude other information. And it might be that contextual information changes the significance of the threat that we perceive. So we might see something that looks like a sign of danger, but if we broadened our attention and saw the wider context, it would reduce the severity of the perceived threat or compensate for it or give us opportunities for coping with it. Basically, the Stoics want us to do the opposite of what we normally do when we're freaking out.
I love the view from above technique that also, for me anyway, points out the millions and millions of other people that I then think who may have a similar problem or worse. I'm not alone. It's a big boat with a lot of people. So I've got a version of that. I don't know if you've heard this before, but there's a book by Michael Singer called The Untethered Soul. There's a little blurb in there where he suggests every time you get into your car, as you're settling into the seat, he said, just stop, take a moment to remember that you're spinning on a planet in the middle of empty space. Then remind yourself you're not going to get involved in your own melodrama. And I don't know why, but that little framing, it crystallizes this view from above just like that for me. And it settles me. It's like, shit.
I know I've been doing this for so long now. I know I've accumulated a lot of view from above trivia over the years. And one of them is like, I think in Monty Python, The Meaning of Life movie, they have a song at the end that kind of is about how small we are in the universe and stuff. It's similar to the view from above. And then also, I think the Rocky Horror Picture Show has a song where it kind of mentions how small we are in the vastness of space and stuff like that. So these ideas crop up. It's perennial wisdom that crops up in different areas of the arts and so on. I mean, in ancient Greece, you find similar ideas in a sense in Homer and definitely in Ovid and other Latin Greek poets.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I've done that before where there's a song by Mel Brooks called Hope for the Best, Expect the Worst. And I have, in troubled times, I have sung that song because it's meant to be funny, but it is so true. Hope for the best, expect the worst. It's all about you're not getting out alive.
That sounds like the Stoics' one of their basic strategies is we call it the premeditation of adversity. But the other thing, but just to give people a kind of another little practical takeaway while we're on that subject, the view from above is spatial, but it's also temporal. It's also chronological. So the Stoics would say Marcus Aurelius, for example, he actually says something that sounds like, it's a little bit ambiguous, but it sounds like he's saying that when he looks at his own image, and it's not clear whether he means in a mirror or obviously he saw his own image everywhere he went because he was such a big deal back in the day, maybe in a statue or a painting or whatever. He says, I look at my own image and I think that I imagine that I'm looking at Augustus, who was the founder of the Roman Empire and died a really long time ago. So Marcus would look at his own reflection or look at statues of himself and imagine that one day he would be a figure in history books, who'd been dead for centuries. So just to remind himself of his own mortality and put his life in perspective. But in CBT, there's one of the easiest cognitive therapy techniques. Some cognitive therapy techniques are kind of tricky. Some of them are too easy in a sense. Again, that it's so easy. Some of them are so easy it generates a problem, because the trainee therapists or supervisee therapists get bored using them. But one of the easiest techniques is to say to people, well, what's probably going to happen next when they describe a feared catastrophe in the future. And that expands their so you think about it this way, right? When people worry about stuff, worry fascinates me, right? Like most interesting things in life, everybody thinks they know what worry is and they just take it for granted. But if we stop to think about what worry is, there's a lot of research on it. And it's quite a weird thing. It's an odd duck worry. If we look at what people are doing when they're worrying, they're sort of thinking about the future, some bad stuff that's going to happen. But to do that, you have to pick a time frame. So I'm kind of worrying about maybe losing my job, let's say. Well, I guess I'm worrying about the lead up to it, and then maybe picturing myself getting sacked or something, and then maybe the days or weeks following, right? And then I stop and I go back to the beginning again, I go around in circles. But why choose that particular time frame, right? We're editing a movie or something. Well, why would you not just go on and imagine what happens a month later or 2 months later? Why would we stop there? It's subtly we're editing this movie of our future in such a way that just by changing the time frame of it, we're making it seem more negative than it necessarily would be if we pictured it in a more rounded and complete way.
We only read 2 chapters of a book and there are 25 chapters to come.
It's a type of selective thinking. And it's also a lie of omission, by the way, because you're leaving information out, that would change the significance of the event. So what we do in therapy is if somebody says, well, what if my girlfriend dumps me? Or what if I lose my job? Or, they're worrying about these things. We might say to them, okay, well, let's suppose it happens. What would probably happen next? And then initially they'll usually say, well, it would suck. I'd be really unhappy and I'd sit at home and I'd cry my beer. And then the therapist might say, sure, and suppose that happens, then what would probably happen next? Say already it's repetitive. And the client would say, well, I'd kind of my friends would all stop talking to me because I'd be so miserable or something. And the therapist says, sure, and suppose that happens, then what would probably happen next? And eventually the client will go, well, I guess eventually I'd have to start applying for other jobs or go out dating or whatever. It would suck to begin with. And the therapist would say, sure, but suppose that happened, what would probably happen next? And then the client goes, well, I guess eventually I'd find another job or I'd find another girlfriend or whatever, and my life would move on. And then suppose that happens, and what would probably happen next? And do. So that does 2 things. By expanding the chronological perspective, it decatastrophizes the event, the feared event, because it seems bad, but maybe it's not permanently bad. So that takes some of the edge off the severity of it by viewing it in a more rounded way. But also at a more subtle level, it tricks the client or forces the client into planning coping behavior. When we worry, we go around in circles. We don't really think about what
we don't problem solve.
Do about it, right? We're not really problem solving. But by asking someone that question, you're basically tying them in a verbal corner, painting them into a corner whereby they have no choice but to start thinking about possible solutions and ways forward in a more matter-of-fact way. And that's a form of the view from above. It's expanding our chronological.
Could one do that? So my audience is listening, bunch of worry going on, anxiety. Can someone do that on their own? And how would they best do that?
Do the same thing for themselves. They could write it down. They could just ask themselves a question. Like any strategy, it's not going to work every time. If someone's very deeply depressed, we don't want them just dwelling in negative consequences. But like any good technique, try using it. In fact, does it seem like this might be helpful? Or you could also ask yourself, is there a good and bad way of using any technique? Because I emphasize that because certain types of clients, particularly clients with clinical depression, often say, I've tried everything and nothing works, because they feel so hopeless. The depression sometimes undermines their ability.
Everything's tainted.
Everything's tainted, right? So any techniques that you use kind of backfire or potentially. So a good way to resolve that is just to test things out and only use it, obviously, if you think it's going to benefit you, or to start considering whether there might be good and bad ways of utilizing the technique and what the difference would be between a good way of using that technique and a bad way of using that technique. But they can just ask themselves, with that caveat in place, with that troubleshooting strategy in place, they can just literally ask themselves. They could write it down on a bit of paper. And their goal is basically just to expand the perspective, focus a bit more on coping and decatastrophize the feared event. Another similar strategy would be to say, if you look back on that event a year from now, how do you think you might view it differently, or how might you feel differently about it? And then if you look back on it 5 years from now or 10 years from now, how might you view it differently or feel differently about it? So sometimes that's called time projection, changing our temporal perspective on things. So either broadening it by viewing it more expansively or putting ourselves in the future and looking back are both easy ways to change the way we feel about things.
I think you mentioned something that we need to emphasize, very important. Not every technique works for everyone the same way, right? So if you're out there listening and you're trying these things, or one or two of them, and it's not resonating with you, try the next. Try something else. This is not something wrong with you necessarily. This may be, as Donald said, some temporal pit that you're in. So there are other techniques to try. I want to go back real quickly because you said something very important. The connection between emotions and thinking, or thoughts and emotions, where you said, hey, if you're feeling bad, there's some thought behind it. So that doesn't always feel true, right? In other words, I sometimes experience negative emotions. I have no idea where they're coming from. Sometimes I have noticed, Donald, that, and please, you're the expert, so make sure that you straighten me out here. But if I'm sleepy or foggy or fatigued, there's a saying that fatigue makes cowards of us all. I think my brain will interpret fatigue sometimes as depression or something's wrong in my thinking. Some circumstances upsetting me, I'm interpreting it differently. When the fog clears, I realize, my brain was trying to explain the fatigue as some kind of distress. Is that possible? Is it always in every case that a negative emotion is tied to thought, whether that's conscious or subconscious?
Short answer is, I would say yes. It is true in every case that a negative emotion is tied to thought, but in complex and subtle ways. So clearly, I imagine some viewers or some listeners would be kind of up in arms about that, because there's obvious counterexamples you can think of. So we need to dig into it a little bit. If somebody runs up behind you and shouts boo, you'll jump out your skin and your heart rate will shoot up, right? So people might say, well, hang on, that doesn't look like it's cognitive. It looks like that was a reflex. It's the startle response, right? That's physiological, if you like. It's an innate reflex. It wasn't that you were thinking something awful is going to happen. You just reacted to a loud noise happening suddenly behind you. And equally, if you drink a lot of coffee, you might start to get agitated and your heart might beat faster and your mind might race because you just consume loads of caffeine. Or if you take psychoactive drugs or have certain illnesses, it might change your mood or your thinking. So it's not true that cognition causes emotions in that sense. Nevertheless, even when those initial physiological changes, you could call them the kind of precursors of other emotions, once those chemical effects or pathogenic effects or like external stimuli take effect, we immediately start thinking. Like cognition comes into play in response to this. So someone turns up behind me.
It's that interpretation of.
Yeah, we then have an interpretation, right? So thinking then comes into play. And the Stoics knew this. They talk about it and explain it. So they even have terminology. They call the initial reflex like involuntary emotional response, propathei, or proto-emotion, or proto-passion. And the Stoics say that's involuntary. Like, we don't control that. It's not necessarily cognitive. But what matters is what we then do next. Do we worry about it? Do we ruminate about it? How do we interpret it? And this is the modern cognitive model of emotion that we use. There are different stages of our response. And it's the voluntary cognitive stage that comes a little bit later that shapes how the emotions develop. And that's where we can come in and change things. But nobody would say that the initial emotional stimulus in every case involves beliefs or thinking. The real answer is a little bit more complex. They're tied together, and what matters is how you respond. So the Stoics' way of describing that is, there's a story. Let me tell you a little story. There's an ancient author called Aulus Gellius, who's a rhetorician during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. And he tells the story that he was on a ship traveling from Greece to Italy to get to Rome, to the port of Brundisium. And one of the hazards of the ancient world is that you get caught in a storm. It's traveling by boat was, you take life in your hands, buddy. Like, it's dangerous. Not apart from the pirates. Like, you could sink and stuff. That's why Poseidon is a big deal. Like, because it's pretty dangerous. And these guys were on a boat and they got caught in a storm and they thought they were going to die. And Aulus Gellius was on this boat. But there was also a famous Stoic philosopher who, teasingly, he doesn't tell us the name of. I could hazard a guess at who he might be. But he says he's a famous Athenian Stoic teacher. Might be a guy called Apollonius of Chalcedon. And this guy goes really quiet. Everyone else is freaking out. They think they're going to die. They're pleading to Poseidon to save their lives. They're screaming for help and stuff like that. But the storm passes and they get to shore and they survive. And they're sitting on the dock and they're all soaked because they've been through this storm. And Aulus Gellius goes up to this Stoic philosopher and he says, listen, I hope you don't mind me. All this doesn't seem rude, but you're a Stoic and you guys are meant to be in control of your emotions. And I saw when everyone was freaking out, you weren't screaming and shouting, but I did notice that you turned pretty pale and your hands were shaking. And the Stoic philosopher pulled out a copy of the Discourses of Epictetus from his satchel. And he read him a passage from it. And he explained the Stoic theory of proto-passions or propathei. And he said, well, the Stoics believe that we have these reflex-like emotions. He said even a seasoned ship hand would turn pale and shake in a storm like that, where he thought his death was imminent. But he says it's an involuntary emotional response to an imminent threat. It's a type of response we'd share with an animal. It's a reflex. Seneca compares it to somebody poking their finger towards your eye, like you're bound to this blink reflex he's describing. It just happens that and also he was getting seasick probably as well, like he turned pale and shake and stuff like that. But he says the difference is that the Stoic doesn't dwell on it catastrophically afterwards. He doesn't continue to freak out about it. He doesn't interpret it in the same way, but he accepts the initial anxiety response as natural and inevitable. Now, in that respect, Stoicism shares some common ground with third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, like the Stephen Hayes you had on your show.
Yeah, acceptance and commitment
therapy. Because the Stoics would say that those initial feelings of pain, discomfort, nausea, anxiety, even fatigue, are natural and to some extent inevitable, or in Stoic terminology, they're not up to us entirely, not directly up to us, they're not directly under our control. That happens first, and then what happens next is our voluntary response to it.
Yeah. Or interpretation
of what's up to us in Stoic terms, and that's what we should take control over and change.
This is great because I want to dovetail into acceptance, but just to put a stake in the ground here, an emotion can be involuntary, but you can then interpret that emotion. So there's the connection with thought. Or you could have negative thoughts can come up and then the emotion follows. So it can go both directions.
What muddies the water here is that some philosophers and psychologists will kind of argue over the definition of what constitutes an emotion. And also there's a problem of translation. One of the hardest things to translate from another language are terms for different emotions. And similar to different languages have different words for different colors. There's a word in Greek that means light blue. Like, we don't have one word for that necessarily that corresponds with it in English, right? So because emotions are nuanced, terminology for different types of emotions doesn't, particularly from ancient Greek, doesn't translate that easily into English. So the terminology that the Greeks use to make these distinctions between different aspects of emotion doesn't exist in the English language, right? Which is kind of scary in a way. Like, these guys were more articulate when it comes to understanding how their emotions work than we are. Like, they might look at us and think that our emotional vocabulary is primitive, in certain regards. Like, so the Stoics make this distinction that we don't really make between propathei, and pathe. So either you could call it the initial precursor of emotion or a certain type of emotion. Like, it would depend on the terminology that you choose. But this kind of first flush, like someone walks up to you in the street and spits in your face and your blood pressure shoots up, like that kind of initial reaction, you might call, Seneca says, I'm not sure whether to call that anger or not. He would call that a proto-passion. So I don't know whether you want to call that an emotion or not, but yeah, we need to distinguish that from the anger, the more ruminative anger that follows on from it, where you start to think, how dare you, what an asshole, like, why did you do that to me? That's all voluntary, or most to a large extent it's voluntary.
So let's talk about the Stoic acceptance and indifference. So the Stoics want to look at external events dispassionately without strong values or emotions to them. Is that right?
Broadly speaking, the Stoics do not believe that external events are completely indifferent. That would be like nihilism. In a way, Stoicism is the opposite of that. But they don't think we should attach such strong value to external events that we become pathologically upset by them, is one way of describing it, right? The Stoics, or another way of putting it would be that the Stoics think we should place more value on our response than we do upon the thing that we're responding to, would be a slightly more technical way of phrasing it. So there is some value, the Stoics have a term for it, they call it axia, that we assign to external, it would be rational to assign to external events, but it's not the same sort of value that would make us depressed or angry. They think we should attach more value to our voluntary responses to things. So what they want to do in a sense is to kind of change the way that we assign value and to soften it a bit would be a way of putting it, but not to eliminate all value.
I've read or heard someone say that for them, struggling means only one thing, that I'm not accepting something. Struggle is a signal. That rings true to me. For me, sometimes I can, when I'm struggling, if I look, I can see some aversion, me trying to push some circumstance away.
It reminds me of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, who is an immigrant. He was washed up. He was shipwrecked at Athens and stayed there, became a philosopher. He said he defined eudaimonia, the goal of life, flourishing, like the human ideal, if you like. He defined, so ancient Greek philosophers were very interested in how you define eudaimonia. The central question of Greek philosophy is, how do we define the goal of life? Like, it's very simple. But, it's interesting. We've almost forgotten the most fundamental questions now, but the Greeks were clearer about it. They were like, well, what we need to be talking about is what's the main goal that we should all be pursuing in life. And they talk a lot about that. We never talk about that today. And they talk a lot about what constitutes wisdom. Now, none of us ever talk about that today either. So in some ways, Greek philosophy is interesting because they address these actually quite basic, fundamental questions. It's the Stoic answer to that, according to Zeno, was that the goal of life is the eudaimonia is a smoothly flowing life, he calls it. And the words that he used evoke this imagery of a stream that's flowing smoothly. And so he thinks that conversely, when we have a problem in life, it's because we're experiencing a kind of inner frustration or turbulence. And that's partly because we're not kind of rolling with the punches of life, as it were. You know, the Stoic goal is to flow past obstacles, to accept them and not to get frustrated with them. So there's a famous, among ancient philosophy nerds, it's famous, right? So there's a famous metaphor that the Stoics use for this that comes from a later Stoic, one of the other founders of the school called Chrysippus. Chrysippus says, imagine there's a dog tethered to a cart. So the dog is keeping pace with the cart. It doesn't have any choice. You know, it's been tied to this cart. It kind of needs to accept it. So what it does is just adapt to it, and it runs along at the same speed that the horse or the mule is pulling the cart is going. And so it goes smoothly. But there's another dog that tries to run in the opposite direction, and it ends up getting dragged along by its backside on a bumpy ride. So he says we need to learn to be like the dog that's running along beside the cart and not the one that's getting dragged along by its backside. So what he means by that is that we need to learn to accept events that befall us in order to adapt to them fluidly, in order to have this goal of the smoothly flowing, unperturbed life. And that doesn't mean do nothing, but it means adapting to things that aren't directly under our control. There are many paradoxes in Stoicism, but one of them is the Stoics have these three disciplines. Stoicism is highly systematic. So it's divided up into various concepts. So Epictetus divides it into three disciplines. And one of them is the discipline of desire and emotion, which is also sometimes called the therapy of the passions. And that has to do with acceptance. It has to do with, you know, not getting frustrated, not complaining, but adapting to the events that befall us. That has to, for Stoics, be combined with the discipline of action, which means acting consistently in accord with wisdom and justice and exhibiting the virtues of self-discipline and courage in our daily lives. So the Stoics want to reconcile action and acceptance. So they want us to accept things that aren't directly under our control so that we can figure out how to adapt to them and cope with them in a way that's consistent, self-disciplined, and courageous.
While you were talking about that, you threw in complaining. Is complaining a sign that I'm not accepting something?
Yeah, I mean, if you want the kind of like real, someone once said to Albert Ellis in an interview, kind of cheekily, they said to Ellis, does your whole system of therapy boil down to learning to say so what to events? And Ellis said no, but he kind of said, well, yes and no. Like, I mean, in a way, but like there's a bit more to it than that. So it's an oversimplification, but it's kind of along the right lines in some ways. There's a grain of truth in that. Stoicism is a complicated and nuanced system, but there is also a grain of truth in the idea that Stoicism is about not complaining. Now, obviously, there are situations where a certain type of complaining might be prudent and adaptive. So it might be that in business, you need to make a formal complaint about somebody that's provided a bad service or something like that. Or you might need to, in a sense, you could call it complaining about symptoms to a doctor.
But,
in order
yeah,
to get
this is to another, not to myself or just.
But it depends how you define the word complaining. If by complaining we mean whining about something like pointlessly or complaining needlessly to yourself.
Yeah, I'm looking for a signal that I'm off. Okay.
Yeah, then 100% the Stoics would say that's a recurring theme in Stoicism is this idea that unproductive complaining is a sure sign that you're not living a smoothly flowing life.
I'm going to ask something that I think would be hard to answer, but I'll throw it over to you. Those are my favorite
questions.
If someone is depressed, and that is oftentimes necessary, somebody needs to talk to somebody, right? If someone's time constrained or they just cannot bring themselves to be vulnerable in a therapist, how would you, I'm just going to ask it because I keep stumbling over it as I think about how I'm going to ask you this, but is there an 80-20 for the ancient wisdom that you could provide someone in your psychological coaching that mitigates or manages depression in a sense, right? Is there a general philosophy that you try to imbue in them that you found helpful?
That was an easy question.
What? Haven't heard.
Easy question. Everyone's got that question in a way. What's the basic general takeaway?
I reach the top of the Guru Mountain. I crawl up there and I get up there and the Guru says, boom, boom, boom.
The problem is that when you get that answer, it's going to be so simple. It's going to seem
that's why.
So the Stoic answer to that would be, sure, the basic thing that you need to do is to continually pay attention to your value judgments and to separate them from the external events to which they refer. So in plain English, that would mean training yourself to be continually mindful of that saying from Epictetus. It's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them, to be continually aware of that. And so you've talked to some cognitive therapists before. The technical term that we use for that, arguably, in modern cognitive therapy is cognitive distancing, or is very similar to a term that Stephen Hayes and behavior therapists use called verbal diffusion. So the tricky part is it's a very simple concept, but it's a slightly abstract concept because it's quite pervasive. So it would be learning, Aaron Beck describes it, the founder of cognitive therapy, says, imagine that you're wearing coloured glasses, like rose-tinted glasses, and you look around and you think, geez, Larry looks pretty pink, and that cat over there's pink, and that house is pink. And then you've been wearing these glasses for so long that you just assume that that's what the world looks like. And then someone comes along and they knock them off your face. And suddenly you think, oh, wow, yeah, Larry's not as pink as I thought he was. And that dog's white. And that house isn't really pink at all. And then you look at the glasses and you think, oh, it's the lenses that are pink, not the external events, right? So Beck says that's cognitive distancing. He says that learning that your beliefs, the beliefs that cause your emotions. So if you think, oh my God, this is a catastrophe, learning that it's not a catastrophe, but you're choosing to look at it through catastrophic lenses, making that shift in perspective is the basic takeaway of Stoicism. So it's learning to notice the beliefs and values that you're projecting onto external events and to realize they're coming from you, that you're catastrophizing, that you're choosing to view something as horrible or awful.
Two separate things happening, the event and then my interpretation.
What we normally do is mash them together, right?
Yes.
And to put it another way, so the basic takeaway of Stoicism is to stop mashing them together.
Yes.
So that we forget the distinction between them. Then you're stuck. Once you kind of think, no, this actually is just a catastrophe, then you've hypnotized yourself. You've duped yourself. Now you've been wearing the lenses so long, you think that
and it happens like that. It happens like that.
And you can't imagine there's any other way. There's a dude over there wearing blue glasses. So he disagrees with you, buddy. He thinks it's a blue house. But when you're fused, when your beliefs are fused with reality, you think, no, the house is pink. This is a catastrophe. This is awful. And the Stoics want us to separate those things and to think, no, you're having those thoughts or imposing those value judgments and beliefs on external events. The external event itself is neutral. Like nature is indifferent. It's just, a jumble of atoms and stuff at the end of the day. You're just projecting all these values onto it. And realizing that you do that gives you a lot more flexibility and a lot more freedom. And it doesn't eliminate your emotions, but it kind of softens them in a way. It makes them less rigid and pathological.
And some people I think we need to generally start doubting, what we know about human psychology these days is, and neuroscience is we don't really see reality. We see our versions of it. I mean, we see some semblance of reality. Well, you did it. I gave you a hard question, I thought, and you just knocked it out of the park. Great.
Why didn't the Stoics answer it?
There you go.
They answered it. They answered it 2,300 years ago because they had more time. The thing is, this is before television. So they had a lot of time on their hands. They weren't distracted by Netflix and by, wars on the other side of the world.
They're hitting me in between the eye. Yeah.
Yeah, they just sat around all day and thought, geez, I don't know, what should we be thinking about? Or how maybe we should think about what's the most important thing in life. What is the most important thing in life then, buddy? Well, is it wisdom or something? Or like, how do emotions actually work? I don't know, like, let's have a chat. So they have these conversations that we never have today because we're too busy arguing about stupid stuff and interfering in other people's business and, things that aren't under our control and stuff, which are important things. The pandemic, the war in Ukraine are like important things. But the Stoics would say, hang on a minute, you need to back up a bit. Like before you start getting too involved in that, there's some basic questions you need to answer about who you are and what's going on inside you and what your goals are in life and what your values are, what you're trying to achieve and what you're doing wrong. Modern life is one continual stream of distractions from the type of questions that might potentially liberate us and lead us to self-awareness.
This has been great, Donald. And before I wrap up, I just wanted to bring up the dichotomy of control, which seems to be a central piece of that wisdom literature called Stoicism.
My favorite dichotomy.
And I wanted to ask you, I see it helpful. Ukraine and what's happening now is a perfect example. But for those not aware, there are things in my control and things not in my control. And there's a lot that's not in my control. This is me butchering the dichotomy of control. But the dichotomy of control helps me with stressful things because I realize, Larry, you have moved yourself into an area where you have no control. You think you do, so it's leading to anxiety and some other things. But can this help with depression as well? Or does anxiety kind of dip into depression when it becomes so severe? And I've just thrown 3 questions into one, sorry.
No, I think that's a good question. And I'll answer it by changing the subject for a moment, just to provide a little bit of context. Because something that I think would help your listeners is the dichotomy of control is famous because of the serenity prayer that's used by Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, we don't know that there's any direct connection, but anyone that reads the Stoics will tell you that sounds so blatantly like it's inspired by Epictetus and other Stoics that it's difficult to imagine that whoever first wrote that hadn't read the Stoics. So we don't know, but it's clearly saying the same thing. I think this dichotomy of control can help us to cope with pathological emotions, and it can also help us to cope with moral action as well. Can it help us to cope with depression? A good question, I think, to ask is to flip the question round, right? Sometimes and say, I don't know, like, how can you make depression worse? I ask that question often when I'm with my clients. I think, geez, I don't know, buddy. Like, if I started copying you and doing the stuff that you're doing, one of my favorite things to say in therapy is I'll get the clients to describe how they cope with their depression or whatever. So they'll say, I'm so depressed, I don't go out anymore, I don't go to the gym, and I don't kind of like socialize with people and stuff like that. I just kind of like sit home and ruminate. And I think it's strange how people have a blind spot for this. But then as a therapist, probably more tactfully than this, like I'm summarizing here, but at some point I might build up to saying something along the lines of, well, that sounds interesting. So if I went home tonight and started giving up all of my hobbies and cutting off ties to all of my friends and staying at home ruminating about my past a lot, I wonder if I could make myself clinically depressed. I'd probably make myself feel pretty bad if I copied your coping strategies. You've told me, clear as crystal, your way of responding to this problem. I'm pretty sure if it was emulated by anybody, it would lead them to a pretty dark place, right? It would make them feel, it wouldn't cause depression, but it would contribute to depressed feelings. So, that just highlights the fact that people's ways of coping sometimes make the problem worse. Well, if we can make the problem worse, the good news is we can make it better, if only by stopping doing the things that make it worse. And I say that because depressed clients, I tell you, here's a paradoxical question. Sometimes I'll say to clients who have depression, we mentioned earlier how sometimes depressed clients can be quite nihilistic about or lack optimism about the possibility of change. So I'll say to my depressed clients, do you think there's anything you could do that makes your depression better? They'll say, no, I tried everything and nothing works. I'll say, is there anything that you do that makes your depression worse? And sometimes I'll have to have a think about that, but usually I'll go, yeah, like, I mean, things I do that make it worse. I think, but surely if the things that you do that make it worse, it follows from that doing the opposite, or at least stopping doing those things, would make your depression better. So I think Stoicism can help people with depression, because what do people who are depressed do? They ruminate. They typically engage in a style of thinking that we call ruminative thinking, that involves posing unanswerable questions, often about the past and about the pervasive meaning of events. So if you sat down, let's say you plug a little listening device into a depressed person's brain and you could listen in on their thoughts, it would be stuff like, why is this happening to me? Why am I so depressed? What does it say about me as a person? And that's every depressed guy's thinking style, basically. Like, it's very broad, like it poses a lot of questions. There are questions to which there are no answers. There's a lot of kind of interminable analysis and rumination. It's quite past focused, right? So knowing that makes people worse, you'd think that countering it might be an obvious strategy to help them, not necessarily cure them, but help them get better. Some things are up to us and other things are not. Sometimes people say, well, sometimes it's hard to tell what things, there's a grey area. Sure. But I'll tell you what's definitely not under your direct control: the past, because it's too late. By definition, like, you can't change the past. And yet, in depression, we're kind of almost thinking often as if we can. We'll ruminate about past events and wish that they hadn't happened to us, which is like the psychological equivalent of banging your head repeatedly against a wall.
We think we can time travel. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the dichotomy of control, first of all, would help us to let go of events in the past by replying to them. Instead of going, what does it mean? Why did this happen to me? If only I'd done it differently. Instead of whining about the past, if instead we say to ourselves, yeah, but, to what extent can I actually control the past? Well, the answer is 0%. However, at a tangent to that, there are things you could do. You could learn from the past. You could change your future behavior based on past events, maybe. But that would be a much more coping style of thinking. It would be a more constructive problem-solving way of thinking, potentially. Yeah. So I think getting rid of the desire to change the past is something that dichotomy of control can help us with, and something that's clearly toxic at quite a basic
rumination
level.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is hallmark the depressive.
Stoicism, I think, learning to think like a Stoic, I think can help us significantly with that.
Donald, this has been great. You've exceeded my expectations. Thank you so much. Tell us how people can find you and any latest books or things that you are up to that our listeners may be interested in.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I very much enjoyed your questions. I always like to speak to someone who's interviewed psychotherapists, actually, or has been thinking about self-improvement, psychology. The questions I use are more interesting. People can find me at Plato's Academy online, and maybe sometimes they're in person in Athens. So if they look up platosacademy.org, they'll find our non-profit, and I don't mind plugging that because it's a philanthropic project. So if they want to support what we're doing, we're trying to kind of bring life back to this historic location in Athens, and trying to encourage people to use the Socratic method, that would be something that they might want to check out. They can find information about me at my website, which is just donaldrobertson.name. My books, I have a graphic novel coming out about the life of Marcus Aurelius and his philosophy called Verissimus. That comes out in June. And then towards the end of the year, I have a biography of Marcus Aurelius coming out for Yale University Press for their Ancient Lives series. I think it's just called Marcus Aurelius Ancient Lives. So they might want to check that out. And people can find me on social media, and they're welcome to get in touch with me if they want to learn more about Stoicism. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on. Have a great day and evening. Take care. You too. Bye-bye. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms.
Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit larryweeks.com, and we will talk again soon.